everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to airbrushing fine lines and some detail tips for you in tonight's video. Now, if you want to start getting down on detail, there are two main things for a start that you need to look at. First thing is your air pressure. When you're going right up close with an airbrush, you don't want to be blasting out 25-30 psi. You've got to start knocking your pressure down. So we are running in tonight's video, I'm running 15 psi and you can go 15 and below. So that's the first thing you've got to look at before you go in to do your detail, is drop your air pressure down. The next thing you have got to have on point is your paint mixture. You've got to have your paint consistency mixed to basically, like I would say, a transparent thickness. If you're going down on your PSI, when you go down low on PSI with opaques, it's very thick because it's a thicker body paint, and your airbrush ain't going to cope with trying to push out a thicker body paint with a lower PSI. So the minute you drop your PSI down, your air pressure, you've got to start thinning your paints out. Now I've got some thinned out golden opaque here. Now I've thinned this right down because I've dropped the air pressure in the Badger. As you can hear, that's quite low. So they're the first two things. Sort your air pressure out so it's nice and low, and then sort your paint mix out so it's nice and thinned out. Get yourself a test panel like we've got here. I've got some lines I've drawn, and I've drawn like a road, like you see the road markings on the centre of a road. Now, homing in your detail skills is all about your trigger control. That is the key thing to airbrushing, is mastering this. And I've said this in a lot of my videos, you've got to master that, because it all goes down to how much paint you put across to get these details down. You know full well, if you're a beginner, you can pull back on the trigger and you can blast a line like 2 inches thick and do a line. When you're aiming to get these fine lines, you are aiming to pull that trigger back about 1 millimeter. So you've got to get your trigger control down and your finger movement accuracy to go to 1 millimeter and under 1 millimeter to get these fine hairlines down. And that takes years of practice. You don't just pick that up straight away and you're doing hairlines, you're going in on like micro portraits and doing pinpoint eyes and eyelashes with an airbrush, because you don't get them sort of details with an airbrush straight away. It takes years and years of experience. But doing these little tips I'm going to show you tonight and mastering your trigger control, you will start to get these details down that you are searching for. When it comes to lines and you want the nice fine lines, don't be rigid with your airbrush. Don't be locked up and move like a robot left to right to get lines. You've got to be loose with it. Think of it as though you are holding a pencil when you are sketching. When you move with a pencil on paper, and when you move freely and fast, you get them nice flowing movements, and that's what you've got to put across to your airbrush when you paint. Don't paint rigid, move with the brush. It's all about them soft transitions and them soft lines. So I've got the paint mixed, I'm running 15 psi. I'm going to drop a little bit of paint in the Badger, and it is a little bit of paint. You can overfill these really easy. I'll just blast a bit out. So this is 15 psi. I'm just going to do a little test, and that is very, very watered down. If I hold it there for a minute, you can see that it's running. So I could come down on the pressure, and that's what I'm going to do. Now I've seen what the paint's like, I'm dropping that pressure down, and we'll just test it again. Now that's running nice. I can get away with that on this paper. I can get away with that for practicing. So the first thing you need to practice is going up to your paper and aiming to get the smallest dot you can get. Now you're not going to see that on camera, but that is an absolute pinpoint with this brush. I'll just zoom in on that with the editing now. You'll see that they're tiny little dot. You can hardly see that. I'll just make them a little bit bigger. So you're aiming to get the tiny dot. If you aim to get the tiny dots, then you can translate that movement of how much you'll pull back in that trigger to get a line, a hairline. So you're moving that tiny amount to get the dot. So you've moved your finger back on the trigger, you've got that paint to where you need it, and then what you're doing is you're getting that paint down to that dot, and then you're moving with the brush. Don't go really slow. Aim to get that paint to where you want it, and then just move with the brush, and you will get the hairlines. The minute you know how much to pull back on that trigger, you will get them tiny, tiny little hairlines like that. And it's just as I say, it's mastering that trigger movement with your finger and hitting and stopping, finding that point where the paint is, holding it, and then bringing it off, taking it in, getting that paint to where it is, and then taking it off. It's all this, guys. This is all what it's about when you need to get these details down. These little test things here I'll show you are just some things to practice, but it's mastering this and then going closer on your work to get your fine lines. So I've done like a little roadmap on this just here, and I've done, like, say, the centre of the road where you've got the lines at the centre of the road. Now if you were to practice coming in dagger strokes on your lines like this, so you're going along, you're bringing your paint on, taking your paint off, and you're working around, you're putting the lines, you can make big squares like this and do them in different shapes, so you're moving with your brush. You've got to learn to move with your brush. Don't be rigid, move freely with your brush, pick up your speed. It's about picking up your speed. I find I learned airbrushing a lot quicker by moving faster than being rigid with it and over concentrating on your finger, because you can tend to over concentrate on your finger. Beginners always press down too hard when they first start out on the trigger. They end up with rings on their fingers where they've been pressing down, they get cramp in the finger because they're over concentrating on that. Ignore that. Once you get your air down, keep your hand nice and soft, move back with your trigger and move with your brush. Concentrate on what you're doing here and this piece will come into play. So the next one, again, just a little bit smaller, and you're working round your road. Just draw yourself a little road and practice putting some nice small lines into these gaps and do different shapes, so you are moving with the brush to get them different shapes, because these shapes, these half moons, lines, half moons, lines, half moons, are all in your artwork, guys. Dagger strokes is the main thing that you will use in airbrushing, I guarantee it. Everything is done with a dagger stroke, that on and off the paint, that soft transition from point to point. You will use that in every piece of artwork you do. It's the main movement with an airbrush is the dagger stroke, and that's what you've got to master. Doing lines, when you see these airbrush artists on YouTube and they're going, how to get lines, how to get fine lines. I do it, we all do it, we're just doing lines, lines, lines like this. Don't go in doing lines like this, one-handed. I can do it because I've been doing it for a long time, but a beginner will be like this, it'll be all over the place. Always bring your other hand up to your brush and steady it yourself. If you want to get a real crisp straight line, put your other hand to the paper so it sturdies your brush on what you're doing, and then you will get them crisp, perfect lines like that. because you've got your other arm and your hand guiding what you're doing. If you try and do that floating with one arm, you're not steadying yourself. Same as a snooker player. You don't see a snooker player using one hand and getting accurate shots. He's got two hands on the cue. One's doing movement that way and the other one is steadying the cue to get that flow right. And it's the same thing holding an airbrush. You need both hands coming up. The other one can guide you on your distance, and it can guide you as a marker when you're sliding along to get lines. It's very rare you're doing lines like that on a piece of artwork. If you're doing hair textures, you are moving like sort of this when you're coming around doing your hair textures. Very rare you see people doing that freehand like this. You've got your other hand there, you'll get that perfect shape each time. And it's dagger stroke again, point to point. You're doing the eyelashes or the eyebrows. It's the same movement, but you're putting minimal paint down. You're doing that dagger stroke, but you're doing it very, very fine and a lot smaller. And it all boils down to trigger control, guys. So little practice things to get your details down. Do the little roadmap where you've got the little lines in the center. Go in, you can make these little cubes smaller and smaller and smaller until you're getting hairlines down. You drop hairline in, move around, hairline that way, and it just gets you bouncing on that trigger, mastering that trigger, because it's all about mastering the trigger. Airbrushing, you've got to get this down as a beginner, you really have. Else you'll just beat yourself up and you'll put that down and you won't pick it up again. Once you've got that mastered, everything else becomes easier. Artwork becomes easier when you've got this mastered. It really does. Mastering your paints as well, learning your pressures. If you're going down on detail, get your paint mix correct. Drop your pressure down. Don't go in at 30, 40 psi with the brush about 5 mil off the paper, because you are just going to blow paint out. It's going to spider out. You've got to drop that pressure down till you can feel it. Do a little test, pull back on your trigger, see how that's spidering there. And that's what beginners get, and that's why they beat themselves up, because they've either got their paint too thin or they've got too much pressure. I can control that by how much paint I put down with the trigger and the distance from the brush. I don't spider it now because I know exactly how I can work that pressure that I've got and how much movement I'm putting in that trigger and how much paint I can get to come out from to the airbrush. So it's mastering this. All this and this is just mastering that, guys. That's all it is. Your details, your fine lines, it's mastering that. Mastering your air pressure, mastering your paint. So I hope this has helped. Just get doodling, guys, get practicing, that's what it's about. Get some pieces of paper up, have a play with your paints, thinning them down, practice with your air pressures, bring your hand up to your brush and move. Don't be rigid with it, don't tense up. Everybody tenses up, the beginners all tense up, they tense their bodies up, they press down too hard on the trigger, they get finger cramp because they're pressing down too hard and they're over concentrating on what they're doing. Just think of it as though you've got a pencil in your hand and you are sketching, and move with it. If you start getting lines like this for a start, big thick lines, it doesn't matter. Once you've mastered your trigger, you can go from big lines like that, you can start coming in, bring the lines down, and then you can start going right down and getting them fine lines. And I've run out of paint again. I've got to get used to this badger, guys. Minimal paint. I should have put a bigger cup on, airbrush on, so I can do more. But yeah, you can go thick, start working down, less movement on that trigger, bring less paint out, and you will get them little fine lines. And once you know where that sweet spot is on that brush, you can just go straight in and you can hit them little whispery fine lines, because you know exactly how far back to pull that trigger and keep it at that point and flick it forward, flick it on and off, and you'll get these tiny little fine lines. You'll pick it up really, really quick. So move with your brush, don't be rigid, let it flow. Think of it as though you're sketching with a pencil, and you will be good to go. So I hope that helps, and I hope you join me in the next one, because we're jumping on to artwork tomorrow. I'm going to be finishing the Iron Man. It's going to be part 7 we're moving on to. Got a bit of artwork to do, and then we're moving on to clear coat. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.